Ready? Okay, so we'll start with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody, and this is supposed to be the beginning of the spring term, but it still seems like winter. Yeah, it's hard to believe that we didn't have a class since last December. Though I was teaching 3 classes a week during the month of March in California, so maybe it seems like I've been teaching continuously. Excuse me? Oh, I thought somebody said something. Okay, so we have been going through the Anguttara Nikaya, the book of the twos, and just taking whatever suttas come up that are of interest. You know, that the suttas here, it seems like somebody took a deck of cards that had been arranged in aces, spades, diamonds, hearts, and in a numerical order, and then just shuffle them so that you don't know what's going to come up next. Okay, so we'll resume at sutta number 21, and the title of this chapter is Fools, which doesn't mean that every sutta is concerned with fools, but the first sutta is concerned with the distinction between fools and wise people. Okay, so the sutta reads, so there are 2 kinds of fools. What are the 2? One who does not see his transgression as a transgression, and one who does not, in accordance with the Dhamma, accept the transgression of one who is confessing. So those are the 2 kinds of fools. And then in contrast to that, there are 2 kinds of wise people. The one who sees his transgression as a transgression, and one who, in accordance with the Dhamma, accepts the transgression of one who is confessing. So those are the 2 kinds of wise people. And this sutta is formulated against the background or in the context of the monastic procedures. So with a little reflection, we could give the principles here a wider application. So first, what is the context, or what is the application within the context of monastic life? Okay, so that the Buddha has laid down a code of monastic discipline. It's called in Pali the Patimokkha, or Sanskrit the Pratimoksha. And more broadly, there's the monastic discipline is called the Vinaya, the training or the discipline, which also includes a lot of minor rules that are not in the Patimokkha. And so if one commits, or if one violates any of those rules, one commits what is called a transgression. In Pali, the word is appatti, with a long A. And so there are different classes of transgressions or appattis. So the heaviest class, the most serious class, is called, we use the Pali word parachika, which means, it could be translated literally, it means defeat, defeaters. But the point could be maybe better expressed as expulsion offenses. So if one commits any of those, then one formally loses one's status as a monastic. There are actually parallel patimokkha's for monks and for nuns, for bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Okay, so for the monks, the 4 expulsion offenses are committing sexual intercourse, which can be either heterosexual, homosexual, doesn't matter, but as long as there is any kind of penetration, then one commits that offense and one has to relinquish one's status as a bhikkhu, as a monk. The second is stealing an object of a particular value. The value in the Vinaya, it's expressed in terms of the currency in India, in ancient India. I don't know, there are different opinions about what that would be equivalent to in US dollars. But I would say that it would be stealing an item of such a degree that one would be subject to some kind of legal penalty in today's legal code. But, since there's some ambiguity about the degree of severity, the wisest advice is don't steal anything. Okay, the third is killing another human being, which could include even encouraging somebody to kill another human being. So giving the indirect, or giving a command or suggestion to kill, or encouraging somebody to kill themselves. And then the fourth is knowingly making a false claim to what is called a superhuman state or a superhuman attainment. There would be attainment to the jhanas, the arupa attainments, to the paths and the fruits. Generally, I think the reason for this is because lay people are inclined to look in the ancient India during the Buddha's time, people are looking for people of superior attainments in order to make offerings to them, with the idea that this will increase their merits. And so if somebody falsely makes a claim to superior attainments, then they are seeking to win the praise, esteem, admiration of the lay people, and especially to get material offerings from them. So that's the heaviest class of transgressions. Then below that is a class of offenses that doesn't entail expulsion from the Sangha, but it entails some kind of, call it some penalty, a rather heavy penalty that has to be undergone. So one is in effect treated as a little bit of, you could say, bordering on being a pariah from the monastic order, though one is still a member of the monastic order. And one has to go through a rather complex procedure in order to be cleared of that offense. And then below that are various classes of offenses that can be cleared by confession. In that case, all that is necessary is to confess the offense. For a monk to confess to another monk, for a nun to confess to another nun. Okay, so the principle here is that in order to make a meaningful confession, one has to recognize one's transgression as a transgression, one's offense or violation as a violation. So somebody might be engaging in transgressions and doesn't see them as such. And then if somebody points them out and says, you've committed a transgression, sometimes even monks, not perfect morally, far from perfect, so they will live in denial. They will deny that they are committing transgressions. And so if somebody points out a transgression that they're committing, they'll deny it and say, you have misunderstood, you didn't perceive me correctly, you have some kind of prejudice against me, and so you're criticizing me in order to express your prejudice. Or you have some kind of resentment against me, and so you're trying to put me down by accusing me of a transgression. So in this way, a monk might not see his transgression as a transgression. And that would be the case. One who lives in that way, who behaves in that way, would be a fool. Of course, if somebody points out that you've committed a transgression, it doesn't mean that you immediately have to accept what that person says, but you could ask for elaboration, for clarification. You can, on your own, you could check your behavior against the text of the code of discipline. But once you see that the person who is criticizing you has valid reasons for pointing out those faults, then you should recognize that I've committed a transgression. And then having recognized that one's committed a transgression, then one should make the confession of it. That is, if it's an offense that comes within the class of those that can be cleared through confession. If you've committed an expulsion offense and somebody points it out, and then you see that you have committed this, then the honorable thing to do is to take off one's robes, fold them up, change them for lay clothing, and leave the Sangha. Okay, but then there's also a case where somebody recognizes the transgression as a transgression, and then he goes to another monk and wants to make the confession, but the monk to whom he's confessing doesn't accept the confession. That's what's meant by one who does not, in accordance with the Dhamma, accept the transgression of one who is confessing. Yeah, this is a little bit, if one takes this literally, it could lead to misunderstanding. Because, say, you've committed a transgression and you confess to me. I don't accept your transgression in the sense that I say, hey, that's a good idea, let me do it also. So rather it means that you accept the confession of the one who is confessing. So say Bhikkhu X confesses to me, and then what I do, I say to him, do you see your transgression? And then he says, yes, I see it. And then I say, in the future, you should not repeat that, you should restrain yourself in the future. Then he will say, I hear you, and I will restrain myself in the future. Then the process is over. Okay, but it might be that the monk to whom one is confessing the transgression doesn't accept it. He won't let you clear your offense by confession, because in that case, the monk who's receiving the confession, he might be a monk of good conduct himself, not engaging in transgressions himself, but he has a rather stubborn mind, and maybe he has a resentment against the offending monk and ill will towards the offending monk, and he wants to create obstacles for the offending monk to prevent him from clearing himself. And so for that reason, he'll prevent him from, he won't accept the confession. So the correct procedure, which is laid down, is the procedure for the wise people. So when one commits a transgression, one should see it as such. Then one should confess it, in this case to another monk, and then the one who receives the confession should accept the confession, and that way helping the offending monk, the transgressing monk, to clear himself and to rehabilitate himself. Okay, so that is the way it's explained, I say, in the context of monastic life. But we could see this, maybe apply this in lay life as well. Do you have any experience in this in your Sangha? You have, maybe you could, if you take the microphone, you could explain how it's done. Is this a universal procedure laid down for the groups associated with the Plum Village? It's the same procedure. You have to flip the switch.
Is it on?
Yeah, now it's on.
Yeah. It's called beginning anew.
Yeah.
So if there is, I'll take it from the lay perspective first,
Yeah.
like within the Sangha. If within my own lay Sangha, say I have a problem here with Ravi, we're both in the same Sangha, and something occurs and we do have like a serious incident with us, between us, that when we realize this has occurred, we have like a 3-day waiting period to really reflect on this, and then we agree to meet and discuss this. It can be discussed alone or in the midst of the Sangha, but there's only 3 days to resolve this. And it's the same within the monastic community, that if a monk has a problem with another monk...
So this is actually, it's a way of sort of resolving conflicts.
Yes.
Yeah. But how about in the case of you undertake everybody undertakes the 5 precepts?
Yes.
And if somebody violates one of the precepts?
Within the lay community, there's nothing strict.
Yeah, so there's no actual procedure
right,
laid out.
But for the monastics, there is.
The monastics would have to follow the procedure of the Vinaya. Yeah.
Within the lay, it could still be involving precepts that something occurs, but it doesn't necessarily have to be resolved.
Yeah.
Where the monastics, it's yes, but it's the beginning anew. I believe it's online from Plum Village too. It's really a helpful procedure for anybody.
Yeah, that's a good way for resolving, say, conflicts, arguments, just the quarrels between people. Yeah, the Buddha actually, he didn't lay down, it's quite unlike the Roman Catholic regulations, where if you commit, I don't come from a Catholic background, so I don't know the details, but if one commits one of the sins, then one goes to the church and one confesses to a priest, and then the priest would give one usually a particular, what do you call this? Penance. We have somebody from a Catholic background. Okay. Particular penance, like recite 100 Hail Marys.
No, they're very easy going nowadays.
You could be reciting a prayer, or you could have to do a deed.
You have to do.
To do a good deed.
Oh, to a good deed. Yeah. Yeah.
But sometimes an individual is ill-equipped to accept another's confession because you're not fully aware of the extent of the transgression, and that transgression may have affected somebody else, right? I mean, it could be. Sometimes it's a situation where somebody comes and confesses something to you.
Yeah.
Which may not affect you.
Yeah.
It may be pertaining to someone else.
Yeah.
And you do not have
Yeah.
the full knowledge
Yeah.
of the extent of that
Yeah.
transgression.
Yeah.
I don't feel there's anything wrong, obviously,
Yeah.
in doing some lip service and forgiving the person.
Yeah.
But the person, and this is the case of Ajatasattu, right? Even in Buddhist literature, he was responsible for the demise of his father.
Right. He actually arranged.
Even the Buddha could not forgive him.
Yeah. The Buddha doesn't actually forgive transgressions. Yeah. But in the case of the monastic life, say we have 2 monks, A and B.
Yeah.
So A commits the transgression, and he's aware of it. He goes to B to confess. B doesn't have to know the full extent of all of the repercussions of the transgression that A has all of the repercussions that will follow from the action of A. In order for A to be cleared, all A has to do is to confess to B. Then he's cleared in terms of monastic law of the offense. In terms of the karmic consequences, that's another matter. Okay, let us say I tell deliberately a lie to somebody. Okay, that lie might set off a stream of consequences. So I tell a lie, I'm A. So I tell a lie to B. Well, let's see. I'm A, so I tell a lie to C. C tells to D. D tells to E, F, G. And before long, G goes onto his Facebook page, puts it in, and before long, half the world is saying, that's what A has told that lie. Okay. And then the stock market crashes. 3 senators declare that they won't run in the next senatorial election. Okay, but I recognize I'm A, that I told a lie. I thought that was wrong. Then I go to monk B and say, I confess I told this lie. B says, do you see your transgression as such? I say, yes, I see it. B says, don't commit that transgression in the future. I say, yes, I won't commit it in the future. In terms of monastic discipline, I'm cleared. But because of those repercussions, there could be an accumulation of karmic consequences for me coming from that lie. Okay, maybe we should, unless does anybody have anything else? Ken, is it you, Ken? Is that correct? Yes. Kenneth, yeah. Please take the wireless mic.
Bhante, is it possible that the purpose of the confession is for the person who's done the transgression to not live in the past, but it's like a way to live in the present time? Like it's a way to...
Yeah, it's a way to sort of clear the mind of remorse.
Yeah.
And also it ensures, I would say, that the monks don't hide their offenses. Because if one hides the offense, conceals it, in fact we're going to come to that in the sutta mentioned a little down below, then I would say that it increases the tendency to repeat those kinds of actions or even to engage in worse actions. Because one knows that one can get away with it without being responsible to others. Is that Suki? Yeah. Okay.
Bhante, when there is like a junior monk and a senior monk,
Yeah.
2 people living in a small community, and when the junior monk becomes really upset about the senior monk's behavior and got angry, becoming really angry, is it part of the transgression or not?
If the junior monk becomes angry with the senior monk,
Yes.
the anger alone won't be a transgression. The actual transgression has to come through bodily action or verbal action.
What do you mean by verbal action? You mean say...
If the junior monk hits the senior monk?
Not physically, but say become angry and has like an angry verbal sort of talk.
Yeah.
That's an...
If he engages in denigrating talk, sort of deliberately denigrating talk in order to put down the senior monk, then it's a minor transgression.
And
one that can be cleared through offense.
And
one that can be cleared through confession.
When that happens, that the senior monk has a right to expel that junior monk to other place.
I would say no, he doesn't have that right. Though if the junior monk in the case of a single transgression, if the junior monk repeatedly denigrates the senior monk to the point that there seems a little likelihood of establishing harmony within that community, the senior monk might suggest rather strongly to the junior monk that he find some other residence. Okay, one more, then we'll move on. Okay, Will?
Bhante, what if I confess a transgression, right, but I don't confess, like, if I'm a monk, what if I don't confess the full extent? Like, if I say, oh, I killed a rat,
Yeah.
but in reality I'm running like a full pest control company and killing millions of rats.
Well, if you're a monk, you wouldn't be running a pest control company.
I mean, that would be a transgression in itself, so...
Excuse me?
Well, that would be a transgression in itself, wouldn't it? Like if I was secretly running a pest control company as a monk.
You wouldn't, you would have to give up that company to become a monk.
I suppose, yeah. But if I don't confess the full extent.
One should confess the full extent, or at least indicate what is done, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So instead just say, I've been killing a lot of rats with a company.
Well, if you've been killing a lot of rats, then we should confess that one has, on repeated occasions, killed rats.
Okay.
Okay, I think
All
we'll
right.
have to move on now.
Yes. Next sutta.
Oh, this is an interesting one. Okay, these two misrepresent the Tathagata. Which two? One full of hate, who harbors hate. Oh, I'm sorry. And in the back, how is the size? Can you read the back? In the back, can you read the screen? Jin? A little bit larger. Okay, so these two misrepresent the Tathagata. The Tathagata is the Buddha, of course. So what are the two? So one full of hate, who harbors hatred. So this is pretty much self-evident. So it could be somebody within the Buddhist community who maybe then loses their confidence in the Buddha, and then they leave the Buddhist community, and then they start misrepresenting or slandering the Buddha. The case that's mentioned in the commentaries to illustrate this, there was a monk by the name of Sunakata. He must have taken ordination originally out of confidence in the Buddha, devotion to the Buddha, but he always wanted the Buddha to perform, we call miraculous deeds, displays of miraculous powers. And the Buddha refused to display his supernormal powers in order to satisfy the craving of that monk for some kind of miraculous confirmation of his faith. And so gradually over time, that monk became more and more resentful of the Buddha. And also he thought that a really enlightened person should engage in extreme types of austerity. And he saw that the Buddha taught the middle way, not being austere, not being self-indulgent. So there are several occasions mentioned this is in the Duka Nikaya, I think it's sutta number 22, 23. Might be sutta number 24, the Patika Sutta, where the Buddha is walking with that monk as his personal attendant, and in the distance they see some other ascetic who's walking around on all fours and barking like a dog. And then Sunakata says, that ascetic there must be enlightened. And then the Buddha says, you wouldn't know an enlightened one if you saw him. And then the Buddha says, in 7 days from now, that ascetic will be walking around wearing high fashion clothing with his hair neatly groomed, with a neatly barbed beard, indulging and enjoying in the 5 objects of sensual pleasure. And then 7 days later, they're walking down the same street, and who do they pass but that former dog ascetic who's now walking around wearing fashionable clothing, neatly, his beard and hair neatly trimmed, holding the hands of his girlfriend, his new girlfriend. Okay, so over time, then he developed more and more resentment towards the Buddha, and then he left the monastic order and went in the city of Vesali, which was like the high, one of the major cities in northern India in the Buddha's time. And he would go to the council of Vesali and denigrate the Buddha and say that the Buddha doesn't have any kind of supernormal powers. He teaches a doctrine that he's just figured out through his own intellectual reflection. So that is one full of hate who misrepresents the Buddha out of hatred. And then the second one is interesting. It's the one who is endowed with faith and then misrepresents the Buddha because of his, the Pali word here is actually du-gahita, because of his wrong grasp of the teaching. Yeah, and then the commentary sort of takes this passage and illustrates it with the case of, there were different Buddhist schools that emerged in India, several hundred years after the Buddha's passing. And then one of those, which flourished in the region of India that now corresponds to Andhra Pradesh, it was called the Lokottara Vada. And their distinctive teaching was that everything about the Buddha is world transcending. In fact, they held that the real Buddha is always sitting in some kind of celestial realm, absorbed in samadhi. And what we see as the Buddha who walks on earth, goes on alms round, teaches people, goes to the toilet, goes to sleep. That is just a kind of projection or emanation of the Buddha who is always sitting absorbed in samadhi in some celestial realm. And so their doctrine was that everything about the Buddha that we see is world transcending, that there's nothing about the Buddha that's mundane or ordinary. So they say even all the parts of the body, such as his head hairs, are world transcending. Okay, so those are two who misrepresent the Buddha. Okay, then we come to another sutta which speaks about two who misrepresent the Tathagata. One who explains what has not been stated and uttered by the Tathagata as having been stated and uttered by him, and one who explains what has been stated and uttered by the Tathagata as not having been stated and uttered by him. And then there are two who do not misrepresent the Buddha, one who explains what has not been stated and uttered by the Tathagata as not having been stated and uttered by him, and one who explains what has been stated and uttered by the Tathagata as having been stated and uttered by him. Yeah, this sutta could be taken as somewhat problematic from the history of the development of Buddhist literature. And the reason I say this is problematic is because it's pretty evident, on numerous grounds, that the Mahayana Sutras were not actually spoken by the Buddha Gautama in the 5th century BC. And yet I try to take what I call a developmental perspective on the unfolding of Buddhist literary history. So I don't like to say the Mahayana Sutras not stated and uttered by the Buddha, therefore they are misrepresentations of the Tathagata. So what I would say, taking a pretty cautious position, is that they are attempts to bring out maybe aspects of the Buddha's teaching that may have been implicit within his original teaching, but had not yet been made explicit. And so this would be the attempt of later generations reflecting on the teaching that come down in the Nikayas and the Agamas, and then attempting to bring out these implications and to make them explicit. For example, one major topic that is not explicitly treated within the Nikayas, what is the particular course that the Buddha himself practiced to achieve Buddhahood? So it seems to me quite evident that in fact it's even recognized within the Theravada tradition that the Buddha went through many lives, many aeons, practicing as a bodhisattva. And then all Buddhist traditions developed a teaching of paramis or paramitas, the qualities that a future Buddha has to develop to achieve Buddhahood. And yet within the Nikayas, the oldest texts, we don't see anything about paramitas or about a deliberate course to achieve Buddhahood. And yet I have to say also that there are various things that I see in the Mahayana Sutras that I have to disagree with and say, wait, that goes contrary to the principles of the Dhamma laid down within the early teachings. I don't know, does anybody else have any thoughts about this? Yeah, you have the microphone.
Bhante, would you consider the tales of the Buddha's past lives as sort of the doctrine of how to attain Buddhahood, like the Jataka tales?
It seems to me that the Jataka collection is very much a mixed collection. So some of the Jatakas illustrate the development of extraordinarily wholesome qualities. And we could see these as exemplifying certain of the paramis or paramitas. But many of the Jatakas seem very much like folk tales or tales showing a kind of folk wisdom, which perhaps were even in circulation in India as part of the floating body of oral literature, pre-Buddhist oral literature, which then got absorbed into Buddhism and assimilated into Buddhism by identifying the hero of these stories with the bodhisattva.
Yeah, because there's a lot where he's talking about someone walking through a forest and slaying a demon, and then he says, oh, and the demon happened to be the past life of that guy over there.
Yeah.
And then the monk who slayed the demon was you, and I was the bird. They're all very good, though.
Yeah. In fact, the Jataka stories themselves are not canonical, but belong to the Jataka commentary. So when we open up a book of the Jataka stories, then we read them and we think, this is the Jataka collection belonging to the Pali Canon. But the Jataka stories are the commentary, and what actually belongs to the Jataka, to the canonical Jataka, are the verses around which the story is developed. So the verses are embodied within or embedded within the story, and the story is intended to clarify the meaning of the verses.
Yeah.
Without the commentarial story, it's very hard to make sense of the verses.
Yeah, they're just kind of random, seemingly most of the time.
Yeah. In the back, that's Treya, right?
Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
One thing, this is just my particular bugaboo, but what I find also in the Chan and Zen texts, and it was made worse by the 1950s Dharma bums and Alan Watts and all that, is, the idea of instant satori or instant enlightenment.
Yeah.
It's quite obvious from the suttas that it's a gradual path. It doesn't happen 1, 2, 3. If you read the famous Zen stories,
Yeah.
people magically becoming enlightened just poof out of the blue.
Yeah.
Because of one hand clapping and all that, that's really in direct contravention, in my opinion, of what I read in the suttas. That would be one thing.
Let me just answer that. It's actually the distinction that you make between Chan or Zen and the early teaching is not as sharp as it seems to be. I would say that kind of misunderstanding of the Zen tradition was disseminated maybe through the writings of D.T. Suzuki, where you read...
Yes, all of those, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
you read an account in D.T. Suzuki, the student comes to the master and says, "What is the Buddha?" And then the master says, "Go wash your mouth."
Right,
And
or the
then-
master smacks him in the head or something like that.
Yeah, and then
too.
the student gets enlightened. Okay, that leaves out the fact that what would have been taking place in the Zen monastery is that those students, disciple monks, would have been meditating, 6 to 10 hours a day for 8 years, 10 years, asking the master questions over and over and maybe getting evasive answers till the point where the master sees that the student is just on the verge of that opening or awakening. Then the master will do that thing like making that incomprehensible reply or hitting the student, and then the student then achieves enlightenment on that spot, or that's Satori or Kensho.
Satori is,
Yeah.
in Japanese.
Okay. And the counterpart, we also find a counterpart to that within the texts of early Buddhism, where somebody might be meditating many, many years. My favorite example of this comes in the verses of the Therigatha. These are the verses of the elder nuns. There's one nun, I think her name was Siha, which means lioness. So in her verses, she says, "Since I've become a nun, it's been," I'm just making the number of years up, "it's been 10 years since I've been a nun, and I didn't have a moment of a peaceful mind. My mind was always overcome by the defilements. So I decided no point going back to the household life, no point continuing as a nun. So let me go into the forest and I'll just hang myself." And then she says, "I went into the forest, I found a tree, I tied the rope to the branch, and I put the noose around my neck, and just at that moment, my mind was freed from the asavas, from the defilements." So that's like a case of, you call it sudden enlightenment.
And I just had
Yeah,
one. I
and
just
also
had
just
another.
another example is that of
Oh.
the person who became the monk, Sariputta.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
the chief.
yeah, he went, traveling all over India, consulting with various wise men, different sages, trying to find the way to enlightenment. Didn't succeed. Then he met the monk disciple of the Buddha, Assaji, and Assaji just recited this 4-line stanza, and as soon as that Sariputta heard it, he became stream enterer.
Zen and the koans and all are an approach to
Yeah.
gaining enlightenment.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
depends on the individual. If you're approaching
mind asking
enlightenment intellectually,
yeah,
some of these other ways of doing it just may serve an
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, and Bhante, as to the paramis, because as you said, there's nothing in the traditional texts
Yeah.
about, the Buddhist.
There's nothing in the
Right.
early
In the early
canonical
texts.
texts. Yeah.
Just a thought, but maybe the Buddha didn't teach it because it's really not necessary to teach it.
Mhm.
He was very specific. I mean,
Yeah.
according to
Yeah,
the teaching,
Yeah.
he knew all kinds of things, but what did he teach?
Yeah,
Suffering and
yeah,
the way out, and that was
yeah.
it. And I think anything that didn't pertain to that, he could be really cut and
yeah,
dried.
yeah. But
So,
what's interesting,
It's a
though,
distraction.
what's interesting, though, is that even though maybe it would be an interesting topic for somebody to investigate is how and when the concept of the paramis or paramitas emerged in Buddhism. Because we only have them in texts that come from a later generation. We don't have a kind of stratification of the doctrine of paramitas. But first, what I would say is that the qualities that enter into the paramitas are all present in the early texts, but just not presented as such. And then once a doctrine or a concept of paramitas emerges, whether it first emerges in the pre-Mahayana period or in the early Mahayana, it gets absorbed even into the Theravada school. So I mean, in ordinary talk amongst Theravadan Buddhists, they speak about you have to mature your paramis, or you have to accumulate paramis. And if somebody, say, a group of people go to practice meditation, they might start off the same point. Some people will reach deep levels of samadhi or insight. Other people just struggle with wandering thoughts. Other people will meet sometimes physical, bodily obstacles. And they'll say, oh, the difference all depends on their paramis. So the one who makes rapid progress is one who has strong, mature paramis. The one who has trouble with wandering thoughts has weaker paramis. And the one who has trouble with bodily ailments and obstacles has an opportunity to develop his paramis. Patience, equanimity. Okay. Ravi, then Kenneth, then we'll have to move on.
Thank you. Bhante, regarding the confessions, within the Mahasangha, within the Sangha, confessions to senior monk, I understand that. But traditionally in the Theravada tradition, we don't have confession as such. We avoid doing what is wrong. And because I have been told that sometimes when you when you try to confess, you are reliving the negative things that have happened. Yeah. And that itself is not a positive thing in your life. What do you, as Theravada Buddhists, we don't confess.
Wait.
At a temple.
First,
yeah,
you have to remember the distinction that I made between monastic life and lay
exactly.
life.
That's what
in
I said.
monastic life, definitely there's confession. That is laid down.
No,
That's,
I know, what
okay.
in the lay life?
In lay life, the Buddha didn't lay down a procedure of confession that a lay person who breaks a precept goes to a monk and confesses and says, Bhante, I committed this. So there's nothing laid down, but I would say that if a lay person commits, I call a serious transgression, it might be a good procedure for them to
Right.
come to a
As an
monastic
option,
and
yes,
speak
if they
about
want
what
to,
they've
yes.
done. I mean, if somebody slaps a mosquito, then you don't go to a monk. and
Because
say,
sometimes people can think, oh, I can do a crime and go and confess. That doesn't work in Buddhism. You have to lead a life
Yeah.
that is that, am I correct in that?
The thing is, like, once you commit a violation, say, of the 5 precepts, violation of all 5 precepts creates negative karma.
Karma, yes.
So you can't be cleared of the karma by confession.
Exactly.
But if it's a heavy violation of the precept, to clear one's mind, not to eliminate the karma, but
yeah.
one might confess it to a monastic.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Or at least one can go in one's shrine room or before the altar. You can go as though you're speaking to the Buddha himself and say, Bhante, I've done this, and I regret it and pledge not to repeat that deed afterwards.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay, Kenneth, then we'll have to move on.
Just a quick question, Bhante. Is it possible that this sutta right here, I mean this section, the references to saying directly that Buddha said this versus an interpretation of it? Did that make sense?
Actually, that's a good point. It could be taken to refer to, I mean, the Buddha may be not speaking about the unfolding of Buddhism over the course of history, but within his own life.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I want to move on because we come to another sutta which is somewhat related to that. Okay, this is another sutta on 2 who misrepresent the Buddha. And this is a topic which then became a major topic in the unfolding of Buddhist thought over the centuries. So one who explains a discourse whose meaning requires interpretation is a discourse whose meaning is explicit, and one who explains a discourse whose meaning is explicit as a discourse whose meaning requires interpretation. Yeah, so the 2 terms here which are contrasted are nitata. Let me get my notepad. Okay, so the 2 terms are based on the verb neti, which means to lead or even to guide, plus a word atta. This is the same as Sanskrit artha, which means meaning. At least one of its meanings is, quote, meaning. So nita is the past participle of the verb neti. So this is one whose meaning, you could say, has been led or brought out. That is, one whose meaning is explicit. And the way this comes to be interpreted, I now prefer the rendering, one of definitive meaning. So that's nita plus atta. Then the other is a sutta that's ne atta. So this neya means that which should be guided, that which should be brought out. So this is a sutta, a discourse, whose meaning has to be brought out, whose meaning has to be made explicit. So this is one of, maybe you could say, non-definitive meaning. or maybe we could even say the suttas that are nipāta are those that teach the actual truth, or the truth. Is there a non-actual truth? What is that? It's not necessarily evident. Let's say the truth that is to be realized with wisdom. And the sutta of a non-definitive meaning is, we could say, in its expedient teaching, or a teaching that's intended to guide or to lead others to the actual truth. Maybe to lead others gradually to the actual truth. And so here in this sutta, the Buddha is emphasizing the importance of maintaining or recognizing the distinction between those discourses that are non-definitive. Their meaning requires interpretation, or their meaning has to be brought out. Or let's say the discourses which are intended to guide or to lead others gradually to the realization of the truth. And those suttas that are explicit in meaning, those suttas that actually disclose or reveal the liberating truth. And so the commentary gives it actually has a rather long passage on this sutta. So here I said that this question of how to draw the distinction between those two groups of suttas Can you see in the back? Yeah, they should have had between 200 and, it jumps from 200 to 400. Is this better? Okay, so the question about which suttas fall into which category, this became one of the most intensely debated issues in Buddhist hermeneutics. The word hermeneutics means, call it the art of interpretation, the principles of interpretation. So the debate started within the early schools of Indian Buddhism. Then it continues in such later Mahayana sutras as the Akshaya Mati Nirdesha Sutta and the Sandhi Nirmochana. And then this controversy continued even beyond India into Sri Lanka, China, and Tibet. Okay, the Pali tradition decides this issue on the basis of the Abhidharma distinction between ultimate realities and conventional realities. So this is what the Pali commentary says. So there are suttas in which the Buddha says, for example, there is one person who arises in the world for the welfare of the many people. That is the Tathagata. Or these two persons are fools, these two persons are wise people, and so on. So there are many of these suttas, especially in the Anguttara Nikaya, which speak about persons. So the commentary says, those suttas require interpretation because their meaning has to be interpreted in the light of the fact that in the ultimate sense, a person does not exist. Actually, I don't really agree very much with this statement. Or I don't agree with the way the statement is formulated. But I'll come back to that later. Okay, so one who misconceives the suttas that speak about a person, holding that the person exists in the ultimate sense, this would be one who explains a discourse whose meaning requires interpretation as one whose meaning is explicit. Okay, the point here is that when the Buddha speaks about this person or that person, the word person is referring to a cluster of the 5 aggregates. So when we look for the person, where is the person? Who is the person? From the standpoint of investigation with insight, we don't find any concrete entity corresponding to this is the person. What we find are the 5 aggregates, that there's bodily form, there's feelings, perceptions, mental activities, and consciousness. And so the person is a construct, a mental construct, conceptual construct. And so those suttas that speak about one person, 2 persons, or this person confessed his offense to that person, and the person to whom he confessed it didn't accept it. So these have to be interpreted in that the use of the word person there has to be taken as just a conceptual construct. But when we think in terms of entities that can actually be discovered or found through investigation, we don't find persons, but we find bodily form, feeling, perception, mental activities, consciousness. So in that sense, those suttas have to be interpreted. Let's say that those suttas are not of definitive meaning, but are the reason that they're spoken is to provide, we call it practical guidance. They're not showing what is to be investigated with insight, what is to be realized in order to gain wisdom, but they show what one has to do in order to behave ethically, even in order to cultivate the mind in meditation. Like, for example, in the Dhammapada, to take another example, the Buddha says that you should train yourself, you should purify yourself. Nobody can purify another. And the word that the Buddha uses when he says you should train yourself, you should purify yourself, it's the word atta, the Sanskrit atma, the same word that the Buddha uses when he says all dharmas are non-self. So there seems to be, if you just grasp the wording, you would say that the Buddha is contradicting himself. In some suttas, he's saying everything is non-self, yet here he's saying train yourself, discipline yourself, purify yourself. Be a refuge unto yourself. Atta dipa viharata. viharita. Atta sarana, be a refuge for yourself. So what kind of self? You say is no self, just 5 aggregates, no need to be a refuge. So here we could say like those statements are to be interpreted, that they're non-definitive, not to be taken as disclosing the real truth that's to be realized with wisdom. And so then the commentary goes on to explain, a sutta whose meaning is explicit or definitive is one that speaks of impermanence, suffering, and non-self. For in that case, the meaning is simply impermanence, suffering, non-self. So the Buddha says material form is impermanent. Material form, actually I would have to say, when it says material form is dukkha, that has to be explained in terms of our understanding of the English word suffering. But maybe in terms of the Pali word dukkha, it would have been quite intelligible to one who heard it. Okay, material form is non-self. So those are definitive statements. And teachings that speak about dependent origination, independence upon, say, contact, feeling arises. That is definitive. It's just speaking in terms of dhammas or phenomena and their conditioning relationships. Okay, so if somebody grasped hold of this sutta, which speaks, or a sutta that speaks of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, and says that discourse requires interpretation, and then they interpret it in such a way as to affirm that there is something that's permanent, there's something that's pleasurable, there is a self, then that one is explaining a sutta of, they're taking a sutta of explicit meaning as one requiring interpretation. Okay, and we find actually both trends, both of these, call it wrong grasps, appearing in the history of Buddhist thought. Okay, one, at a certain point, as Buddhism developed in India, there appeared a school which picked on those suttas in which the Buddha speaks about the pugala, the person, and said, the Buddha speaks about the person, and so there must be some entity corresponding to that word person, some entity that exists as an ultimate reality, something existing in its own right. And then they face the problem, how do we relate that mysterious entity, the person, to the 5 aggregates? And so they came to a rather mystifying position that the person is neither identical with the 5 aggregates nor something separate from it, but it's a kind of reality that exists in some kind of incomprehensible, even mystical relationship to the 5 aggregates. So that school came to be called the Pugalavadins, those who affirm the reality of the Pugala, the person. So that would be an example of those who grasp the suttas that speak about the person, suttas that require interpretation, and say those suttas are of definite meaning, explicit meaning. Okay, then, of course, we see in the Pali suttas again and again, anicca, dukkha, anatta. impermanent, suffering, non-self. Okay, there comes to appear in time a particular Mahayana sutra called the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. This is the sutra on the Buddha's passing away, in which the Buddha says that he's addressing the monks. He says, the monks, you heard me speak about impermanence, suffering, non-self, and impurity, but those statements were made for, how do we put this? As a skillful means for a particular purpose, to detach people from wrong ideas about permanence, pleasure, and the self. But actually, all along, there is something called, I don't know if that sutta uses the word Tathagata Garbha, but there is something that is permanent, that is truly pleasurable, that is a self, and that is beautiful or pure. Suki is smiling. Have you ever heard that before? Probably it's very common in the Zen or Chan tradition. Yeah, so this became, those kind of assertions became the basis for what was called the idea or theory or doctrine of Tathagata Garbha. Tathagata Garbha, this is the, Garbha means the embryo and also the womb. It has both meanings. And I think there's a deliberate ambivalence here of the Tathagata. The Tathagata is the Buddha. So that there is something within the person which is the Buddha in embryonic form, or that the mind is the womb nurturing a Buddha, and yet that embryonic Buddha always exists, it's always permanent. It's the source of ultimate Mahasukha, the great bliss, and it's the true, unchangeable, unchanging self. Okay, so those who teach one kind of sutta as being of the other kind, they misrepresent the Tathagata, and those who do not misrepresent the Tathagata are those who distinguish correctly between the suttas of non-definitive meaning and the suttas of definitive meaning. Any questions about this, or comments, or? I thought that would set up, spark off a storm of controversy. Okay, Treya?
I mean, anywhere in the canon, I mean, does the Tathagata actually state that he's teaching the ultimate? Or really that his goal was, from what I've read, and God knows I haven't read as much as you.
Wait, I'm not catching.
Okay. From what I understand, is there any place even in the canon where the Tathagata claims to be teaching the, quote, ultimate truth? Rather, anything that I've seen, but I haven't read nearly to your extent, that's why I'm asking you, is he teaches two things, suffering and the way out of suffering.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that stuff about self it's almost like, this is hard for me to articulate, so bear with me.
Yeah.
It's not easy stuff. But it's almost like it's beside the point. In other words, I know some people try to wrap their heads around, I'm just a conglomeration of aggregates.
Yeah.
Maybe so, but what he's also saying is the aggregates are not self. Even if there is, I'm saying even if there is a quote-unquote true self, it wouldn't be any of the aggregates, now would it? But it's almost like it's beside the point, because that doesn't get you to the truth of suffering and the way out, does it? it's beside the point.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you just get into views.
Yeah.
That's just how I
Yeah.
see it.
And also, I think what also has to be pointed out in this connection, the Buddha in the suttas does not say there is no self.
I know.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Because that would also be making an assertion.
It's a
which-
view.
Yeah, that would become a view. Well, anything that can be asserted can become a view. But that would be, I would say, denying the reality of the, call it the empirical or the practical self. So because the Buddha uses the word self when he's giving practical instructions that one should train.
I mean, it's a convention. You have to use convention.
He uses those expressions. But there is a sutta where the Buddha, when he's speaking about self, and then he says, these are expressions, conventions, terms, and designations that occur in the world which the Tathagata uses without wrongly grasping them.
But I don't know if I made my point clear, but it just seems like it almost, that whole question is like where people get so hung up on, oh my God, there's not a self. It's that whole thing where people get so hung up on the whole anatta thing.
Yeah.
Is there a self? Is there not? It's just,
Yeah.
it's beside the point. I think
Yeah.
the Buddha was trying to say, just get away from that, and I want you to look at suffering, and how do you create suffering?
Well,
it's
he
almost
do-
like by making a self and attaching and grasping.
Yeah,
and
I mean, he does
there's the
speak. He
suffering.
does speak about all of the constituents as being non-self.
Right.
So one has to look at them as being non-self. But the reason I say that the Buddha emphasizes non-self is not to set up a kind of another philosophical theory.
But that's where
But-
everybody gets stuck on.
Yeah, not everybody. He uses the theme of non-self because people grasp upon the five aggregates and try to figure out what is myself. And whenever they come to some conclusion, when you look at the conclusion, it's one or another of the five aggregates, either taken as being identical with the self or standing in some relation to the self. And so the Buddha says, look at the five aggregates as being not mine, not I, not myself. Any other observation? Tsering and Will?
Bhante, it's in continuation with this non-self.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what is the entire purpose, but for me, when we contemplate about non-self, what really happens is there is some form of freedom from all those attachments.
Right.
And from that reduction in the attachment, there is some kind of happiness.
Yeah, yeah.
And when you talk about Mahasukha, isn't that also the term you mentioned about Mahasukha?
Yeah, yeah.
Is that also related? When you contemplate on these three things, don't
Yeah.
you get into Mahasukha?
Yeah, actually that will bring sukha, yeah.
Thank
But
you,
this
Bhante.
is taking sukha to be the position here that's sort of rejected, is that the five aggregates are inherently pleasurable. That's in contrast to the idea that the five aggregates are inherently dukkha. But it's certainly not to deny that happiness arises as one progresses in the practice. And then Nibbana, the Buddha says, is paramasukha, the supreme happiness.
Which is you're referring to as Mahasukha, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Bhante.
Bhante, just to continue on with the discussion a little bit about what non-self anatta is and what it isn't, could it be possible that because Pali is an agglutinative language, right?
Is what?
It's an agglutinative language.
Yeah.
So is it possible that perhaps from the perspective of English speakers, it's more difficult to understand what it means? Because isn't anatta, it's used in other much longer words as sort of a component, isn't it?
Anatta?
Yeah.
No, it's
Is it?
no, it occurs just on its own. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but it's also, it's on its own, but it's also in other words. Or in,
No, I don't think it. One could put it into long compounds.
yeah,
but,
that's what I
but
was.
in the suttas, it usually just occurs on its own.
But either way, perhaps there's sort of the context of what's in Pali and Sanskrit, presumably, like the sort of viewpoint expressed within the language itself.
I'm not sure that it's so much a linguistic matter, because I think during the Buddha's time, his contemporaries also found it difficult to understand
Oh, okay.
anatta. Yeah, of course they were very much committed, especially the Brahmins, to some view of the atta, of the self.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So-
Yeah.
Five aggregates, Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sanskara, Vijnana, that's of which the last four, Rupa is a form,
Yeah.
the last four, the last one itself is consciousness. Could this consciousness be the one that people refer to as soul? But of course we call it
It could
anatma
be, yeah.
because
Yeah,
there is consciousness
Yeah.
in the five aggregates.
yeah,
So it is not that there is,
Yeah.
it's just material. It
Yeah.
is not.
yeah.
Ante, from these last couple of suttas, what I'm interpreting is that we are required to be clear in our thinking, and
Yeah.
we are not required to mislead.
Yeah,
And I think clarity of thought is really important.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because we can get caught up in all this. And is this also steering us away from like metaphysics in some ways? Because when we get into the discussion of self and non-self
Yeah.
also, it just veers away from what it's probably
Yeah, I
trying
don't
to
think the suttas themselves are explicitly saying to keep away from metaphysics, but let us say those who misrepresent the Buddha will tend to inject metaphysical
Metaphysics.
views into their exposition of his teaching. Okay, I hear the gong striking, so we could come back at 1, I'm sorry, not 1, 11:30, 12:15, and we could have some more questions and discussion. And one thing I want to mention, that to promote our concert to feed the hungry. This is from my organization, Buddhist Global Relief, which will be taking place April 29th, Sunday, April 29th, at 5 p.m. This will be in New York City at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. That's on East 10th Street. The performers will be Kavita Shah. You know, I don't know who these musicians are. Whether they're famous, I guess they must be fairly famous. Camila Meza, the St. Mark's Choir, and then we'll have special treat, which will be the masked dances of Bhutan. Our Tsering here is the one who helped to arrange this, correct? And so you'll find cards with the information about the concert, and then there are some of these posters. So if you are connected with other temples, centers, or know of, I don't know, places like vegetarian restaurants, health food stores, what are some other places? Community centers, any place where people would be interested in attending. Please take posters for posting. And don't feel shy about taking as many as you need, because I think that we have, do you have more? No? Okay, feel shy about taking. You take a few, but don't be too extravagant. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we share the merits with the devas, the bhutas, the fear spirits. Akasata Jabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditpa Chirang Rakantu Sasanang Akasata Jabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditpa Chirang Rakantu Desanang Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Mang Parang Etavata Hehi Padang Punya Sampadang Sabe Deva Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavata Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Bhuta Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavata Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadaya Avici Hetato Etantare Satakayupapana Arupya Rupicha Asanya Sanino Dukkha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nibuting. Okay, so then we'll stand and then we do 3 half bows to the Buddha.